I'd like to give everybody first a kind of a primer on Theosophy, since a lot of you here today are new to this, might be new to this idea. But Theosophy is derived from the Greek Theosophia, where Theos means God's God, divine, and Sophia is wisdom. And in fact, it is within Theosophy that we do study the divine wisdom and the occult, or the secret doctrine and what have you. The Theosophical Society was founded in 1875 by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, Henry Steele Olcott, and as well as William Judge. A lot of it was based on the writings of Blavatsky that she later published around Isis Unveiled, as well as The Secret Doctrine. And since then, subsequent others have written many texts that we continue to study to this day. To me, a member of the Theosophical Society is to be in sympathy with the three objects, which is one, to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of mankind without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color, to encourage the study of comparative religion, philosophy, and science, and to investigate the unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in man. So I put an asterisk on this, and Ron made reference to the fact that to be kind of true to primary sources, Blavatsky and of course a lot of her cohorts at the time used masculine terms to refer to both genders. We just want to, as I make reference to some things, that we'll be using masculine terms in that respect. And then as far as our lodge in Portland, there are lodges all over the world. We are in alignment with the vision, mission, and purposes of the lodges around, as well as with our national headquarters, which is in Wheaton, Illinois, and international, which is in Adyar, India. But our vision as the Theosophical Society is a vision of wholeness that inspires a community united in study, meditation, and service. And our mission is that we encourage an open-minded inquiry into world religions, philosophy, and science, and the arts. And Ron basically made reference to that in his introduction, in order to understand the wisdom of the ages and respect the unity of all life and help explore spiritual self-transformation. And then our purpose is to really foster a welcoming and open-minded community that's interested in the study of these theosophical concepts and beyond. A lot of this, again, as I mentioned, is founded in the ancient wisdom, which is very much documented by and written about by Blavatsky et al. And we impose no beliefs on our members, and we're united in a common search for truth and a desire for learning the meaning and purpose of existence. Just to give you all some context in terms of a timeline with Theosophy, I wanted to make note that there are some important figures that I'll later reference in my talk around Theosophy. So, for example, of course, the society was established in 1875, originally in New York City, and then later on, Blavatsky published Isis Unveiled. Years later after that, she took on Charles Leadbeater as a pupil, so Leadbeater's name will come up. And then in 1888, she publishes The Secret Doctrine. And then before the turn of the century, she passes away on May 8th, which happens to be my birthday. So, and then later on at the turn of the century, just to note Rudolf Steiner, for example, he became the head of the German Theosophical Society. Steiner also created another kind of offshoot of Theosophy called Anthroposophy. And then also later on, Olcott, who was the president of the Theosophical Society, passes away. And then the reins of leadership are handed over to Annie Besant. And then also Leadbeater, who was a student and pupil of Blavatsky, he meets Krishnamurti in India in Adyar. So Krishnamurti, his name will come up later. And notably, Rudolf Steiner, you would remember him as having opened the first Waldorf school and the Waldorf education and pedagogy. And then later on in the 30s, Besant passes. So these are notable figures and names that you'll encounter throughout the presentation. And to give a context in terms of what's happening in art at the time, at the Theosophical Society's inception, the art movements were already undergoing a shift. Artists were involved with evolving and rejecting the conventional and pushing further the painting medium and their subject matters. A lot of that had to do with the advent of photography and the daguerreotype in the earlier part of the 19th century, so that artists were less concerned about depicting what they were seeing in terms of representational art. And also because at the time, art was very much around either religious iconography or even commissions for wealthy patrons and illustrative scenes of everyday life. So what was happening now were movements that were seeking to create something new, free of influence from the past. And as well as Monet's Le Soleil Levant, which was a breakthrough painting in 1872. It was disruptive when it first appeared at the Paris Salon. Artists were concerned with capturing the impression of the moment. This seminal work gave permission to artists to continue to push the boundaries of painting. I like this cover from this book, Cubism and Abstract Art by Alfred Barr from 1936. Barr was the first director of the Museum of Modern Art in Manhattan, and he kind of illustrates a map of abstract art, Cubism being one of the main kind of movements of the time. And then you'll see in there a little bit around de Stijl and Neoplasticism, which I'll also refer to. And then eventually how it all influences the Bauhaus and modernism and modern architecture. So these are all really important influences that are happening at the time. But inside of this, some interesting things were happening with a lot of these abstract artists. And then on the heels of all of this also was post-impressionism, where the art form is taking on more personal meanings and subjective visions through abstraction. Most notably, think of Georges Seurat with his pointillism, and of course Van Gogh, Vincent van Gogh and his work. And then of course Cubism by Picasso and especially Georges Braque. Over and over, artists were really building upon each other and responding to each other, creating new languages and new visual vernaculars. But most notably today, of course, we're talking about the pioneers of abstract art, and today we'll focus on Wassily Kandinsky, Piet Mondrian, and Hilma Af-Klint, who, because little is spoken really about the connection that they've had to Theosophy and the Theosophical Society. Because in our current time, we take for granted abstract art because it's very common. It's almost it's in the visual language of everything that's around us, especially in media, because it's part of our everyday. Because so much of what we see with commercial art, graphic art, advertising, every time you turn on the television, every time you stream content, you see kind of the echoes of what was first originated by these artists, as those early abstract artists were birthed from the influence of Theosophy. And so it was the key, really, Theosophy that helped to unlock the door to this new inspiration. And that inspiration could be found by mining one's own interior truth and a spirituality that was less kind of Judeo-Christian. It was about having a more direct experience with the divine, and then how do you then visualize that and express that, so they could use this medium to channel and investigate what was happening within and respond to those urges of spiritual expression. So our first artist here with Wassily Kandinsky was born in Russia in 1866. He's credited really as the father of abstract art, and rightfully so, because appropriately he was instrumental really in forming the temperament of the modern artist. And modern artistic movements. He studied law and economics at the University of Moscow. He began his painting studies at 30 years old in Munich, and then he returned to Russia in 1914 at the outbreak of World War I. After the Russian Revolution, as an insider with the Bolsheviks, he established the Museum of Culture and Painting in Moscow. But yet his spiritual outlook differed with that of Russian society, so in 1920 he returned to Germany, where he taught at the Bauhaus until the Nazis closed it in 1933. And then from there he moved to France, where he died outside of Paris in 1944. His notable work here is the Blue Rider, or Der Blaue Reiter. My German isn't great, sorry about that, which he did in 1903. What was significant about this work is that it shows really a series of colors rather than specific details. And this was what would influence his future direction as an artist. And then also around 1911, 1912, he formed a group based on this called the Blue Rider, which then ushered in the Blue Rider period with like-minded artists. And they released an almanac and had 2 exhibits. Yet, as I mentioned, with the outbreak of World War I, this group dissolved and then he returned to Russia. But what's significant here is that in around 1908, he bought a copy of Thought Forms by Annie Besant, one of her books, by Besant and Leadbeater. And so basically, and I see in terms of him joining this Theosophical Society around 1909, but I find conflicting information about that, whether he was an active member, but nonetheless, Theosophy had a significant influence on him. So he wrote concerning or on the spiritual and art in 1912, which was really a huge deal when it came out. And essentially, he basically in this book calls out the Theosophical Society, and I'm going to quote him here in that he says that this society consists of groups who seek to approach the problem of the spirit by way of the inner knowledge. The theory of Theosophy, which serves as the basis to this movement, was set out by Blavatsky in the form of a catechism in which the pupil receives definite answers to his questions from the theosophical point of view. Theosophy, according to Blavatsky, is synonymous with eternal truth. And he quotes Blavatsky here by saying, "The new torchbearer of truth will find the minds of men prepared for his message, a language ready for him in which to clothe the new truths he brings, an organization awaiting his arrival which will remove the merely mechanical, material obstacles and difficulties from his path." And then Blavatsky continues, "The earth will be a heaven in the 21st century in comparison with what it is now." And with these words ends her book. And he, in this case, is referring to her work, The Key to Theosophy, which was published in 1889. But really, there are 3 tenets that he calls out in the spiritual, in art. And he calls this out as the inner need. So again, there's the emphasis on how one responds to that kind of inner need, that inner spiritual drive to express. In chapter 5 of the book, he calls out the psychological working of color. And he says, "It's evident, therefore, that color harmony must rest only on a corresponding vibration in the human soul." And this is one of the guiding principles of the inner need. And as far as the second and third guiding principles, he says that in chapter 6, form is the outward expression of this inner meaning. So it must be evident that form harmony must rest only on a corresponding vibration in the human soul. Again, he's talking about energy and vibration. And this is the second guiding principle of the inner need. And then lastly, it's clear, therefore, that the choice, i.e. one of the elements in the harmony of form, must be decided only by a corresponding vibration in the human soul. And this is the third guiding principle of the inner need. And I love this because he's trying to articulate and capture, again, that artistic and creative drive that seems to kind of come from a divine place that wants to be expressed. And I also, what I really love too about what he had written in the spiritual and art too, is that sounds have color and color have sound. So he's kind of speaking about synesthesia here. He even makes reference to Debussy and Debussy and the colors he hears when he's listening to that music. So then when he joins the Bauhaus in the 1920s, he published his treatise, which was basically a treatise on form, on point and line to plane, which is basically expanding upon the work he did with concerning the spiritual art in art that he had written previously. And he was there invited by Walter Gropius, who was the director of the Bauhaus. So he taught his theory of color and also on basic geometric elements as an objective reflection and an observation of nature. So that's one thing that's common for a lot of these abstract artists, is that they were keen kind of students and observers of nature, but looked to basically translate nature into the abstract and down to its most basic elements. So that's a common theme. So here he, with his treatise, he speaks further the emphasis on design and geometric expression. And one thing to note in terms of the Bauhaus is that it was the template for art schools across the world. A number of us on our talk today, thank you for coming, we all went to art school. And if it wasn't for the Bauhaus, a lot of the kind of pedagogy around art schools wouldn't be here. So when you think about Kandinsky's influence in the Bauhaus, really we're echoes of that as we continue on with our own studies. And then later on with the Nazi Germany, Gropius then fled to the United States, where he went on to teach and lead at the Graduate School of Architecture at Harvard. So as you can see, continue to see this diaspora of the abstract happening across the world. And I actually got a copy of Point and Line to Plane from the library yesterday, and there's some quotes there that I want to share with you guys that I think are really valuable from his introduction. Kandinsky says that every phenomenon can be experienced in two ways. These two ways are not arbitrary, but are bound up with the phenomenon, developing out of its nature and characteristics. So he's talking about the outer and the inner, externally or inwardly, and this connection between the outer and the inner. He said that the street can be observed through the window pane, which diminishes its sounds so that its movements become phantom-like. The street itself, as seen through the transparent yet hard and firm pane, seems set apart, existing and pulsating as if beyond. As soon as we open the door, step out of the seclusion, and plunge into the outside reality, we become an active part of this reality and experience its pulsation with all our senses. The constantly changing grays of tonality and tempo of the sounds wind themselves about us, rise spirally and suddenly collapse. Likewise, the movements envelop us by a play of horizontal and vertical lines, bending in different directions as color patches pile up and dissolve into high or low tonalities. The work of art, and he means here art as a discipline, mirrors itself upon the surface of our consciousness. However, its image extends beyond, to vanish from the surface without a trace when the sensation has subsided. A certain transparent but definite glass-like partition, abolishing direct contact from within, seems to exist here as well. Here too exists the possibility of entering art's message, to participate actively and to experience its pulsating life with all one's senses. And so he definitely goes deep, and then he goes further into talking about point. And here are some images that I picked out from his book. For example, point in terms of stars in the universe, line in terms of thunder and lightning, and then of plane in terms of geometry and sacred geometry. And much of this is what has informed his visual language going forward. Next, we take a look at Piet Mondrian. Piet Mondrian, who was very much a devotee of Theosophy, who was born in 1872. He passed away in 1944, who joined the Dutch branch of the Theosophical Society in 1909. And we could say that he was indeed the father of modernism, a pioneer of abstract art where his artistic vocabulary was reduced to geometric elements and a purposely constrained color palette, which doesn't seem like a big deal in our current time, but Mondrian was the first really to do this. He was born into a strict Calvinist family and was fascinated by the esoteric. So of course, then he was very much drawn to Theosophy. In 1908, he became aware of the Secret Doctrine written by Blavatsky. As well, he was attending Rudolf Steiner's lectures in the Netherlands. And of course, there was Steiner's parallel movement of anthroposophy, which was the spiritual world being accessible to human experience. So these were very much influential on his aesthetic. And many of his cohorts were theosophical artists. So these two paintings here, Devotion and Evolution, were his foray first into symbolism. And symbolism as an art movement of the late 19th century was around seeking to express absolute truths through metaphorical images and language, which is another artistic movement that I adore. What's interesting about these is he starts to get into symbolism as well, with the stars and the color palette and what have you. So yes, he joined the Theosophical Society, and then in 1911, and I thought this was interesting, he moved to Paris, and he rented a room from the French Theosophical Society before he actually found his studio. And then in 1914, he proclaimed that art is higher than reality and has no direct relation to reality. To approach the spiritual in art, one will make as little use as possible of reality, because reality is opposed to the spiritual. And then we find ourselves in the presence of an abstract art. Art should be above reality, otherwise it would have no value for man. And it's interesting his use of the word reality, because as Theosophists, when we speak about reality, it actually means something different to us, the ultimate reality in terms of universal truth, which I won't really get into here, but I just thought I wanted to point that out. I thought that was interesting. And we could probably discuss it a little further toward the end of the presentation. So what Mondrian then later on would found a movement with Theo van Doesburg of de stijl, or the style, and this notion of neoplasticity. And this de stijl movement that Mondrian basically created from around 1917 to 1931, it was a breakthrough where artists aimed for pure abstraction, and that the color palette was reduced to black, white, gray, and primary colors. And Mondrian called this form of he called it a form of neoplasticism because of its horizontal and vertical configurations of squares and rectangles. He was influenced by an essay written by M.H.J. Schoenmakers in 1915, who was a mathematician and a theosophist, who said that the two fundamental and absolute extremes that shape our planet are, on the one hand, the line of the horizontal force, namely the trajectory of the Earth around the sun, and on the vertical and essentially spatial movement of the rays that issue from the center of the sun. The three essential colors are yellow, blue, and red. There exist no other colors besides these three. So it's amazing how he was able to basically translate this idea into something so elemental and so simple, and which was at the time very, very fresh and different and new. And then later on, as he fled to, he left Europe and he went to the United States. He settled in New York City. This piece, Broadway Boogie Woogie, was his response to the architecture and jazz and the sound that he was seeing and hearing in the city at the time. And then he also wrote that, that in 1918 he wrote, "I got everything from the secret doctrine." And I had read somewhere that in his passing, they found in his studio his own annotated kind of version of, with all his notes, his copy of The Secret Doctrine by Blavatsky. He also wrote to Rudolf Steiner in 1921, that neoplasticism is the art of the foreseeable future for all true anthroposophists and theosophists. So what is remarkable about Mondrian is that he's highly influential on design, architecture, and fashion, so making his name synonymous with modernism. But really, the one that we're most excited about as of late is Hilma Af-Klint, as she's the most significant of abstract artists to come to our recent attention. She was born in Sweden in 1862 to a naval family and studied at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts from 1882 to 1887. In 1889, she joined the Theosophical Society Lodge in Stockholm when it was first established there. She had also attended talks by Rudolf Steiner, and also studied at the Goetheanum in Dornach, which was home to Steiner's anthroposophical movement. In 1896, she formed De Femme, or The Five, with 4 female friends, and they would meet regularly for spiritual meetings for the next 10 years, oftentimes conducting seances. And in her seance in 1904, she was commissioned by the angel or a spirit or a guide by the name of Emmanuel, who basically asked her to make paintings from the astral plane that would represent the immortal aspects of man. And this spirit guide of Emmanuel urges her to prepare for her greatest task and to devote the next year to this task and be at their disposal from 1905. And then in 1906, then she begins the paintings of the temple. And then in 1908, as I mentioned, her connection with Steiner, she actually invites Steiner to her studio. And he tells her that her work will not be understood for another 50 years, that she's way ahead of her time. In 1913, Klint gives a lecture on her own spiritual development at the Congress of the Theosophical Society in Stockholm, where Annie Besant is a guest of honor. But what's notable about her in this period is the fact that she's a medium in this case, and channeling through her this work in terms of creating the paintings of the temple. And she came first into my life probably around, I want to say 2013, and I've had the privilege of seeing her works in person in London in 2016 at the Serpentine Gallery and at the Guggenheim in New York in 2019. So, and some of her first works for the paintings of the temple is the series that she called The Primordial Chaos. And these works on paper were probably about the size of maybe like a 11 by 17. She viewed these paintings of the temple as her most important works and her gift of knowledge from the spiritual world. She spent her life investigating world religions, atoms, the plant world. She wrote extensively about her discoveries, and at the time of her death in 1944, she was so concerned that the world was not ready for the knowledge revealed in her work that she said that after she passed, that her work should not be shown for at least 20 years afterwards. And also at the time, you think about a lot of the artists were men, so it was a man's world. But she definitely believed in the spiritual evolution of humans and had hope for the future and that her work would be better received then. And the first time that we saw her work in the United States was in 1986 in a group exhibition at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art with the show, The Spiritual and Art Abstract Painting, which basically covers the range from 1890 to 1985. What's interesting about her work here are some kind of like number 5, number 7, number 16. For example, the spiral is a symbol for her in terms of evolution. And then the color blue denotes femininity, yellow denotes masculinity. The word W you see in the number 5 here is her code for the word matter, and then U for spirit. So she's definitely contemplating and exploring and investigating the notions of spirit and matter in this case. But in terms of scope and scale of her work, they were incredible. In 1915, she completed her works for the paintings of the temple. She had to take a break in between to care for her ailing mother. And in this case, she was able to then interpret a lot of what she felt intuitively inside of her, whereas her earlier works in the paintings of the temple were directly channeled through the guides that were coming through her. And she didn't see painting and drawing as an end in themselves, but an ongoing method of investigation. And she was a mystic with a vision beyond her time because she actually envisioned these paintings to be displayed in a spiral temple. And of course, at the time in 2018, 2019, then these were on display at the Guggenheim, which is a spiral piece of architecture in New York by Frank Lloyd Wright. So she had this vision for the future, no doubt. So what's amazing about the timing and realization of her oeuvre is that it's coming to us now. And her vision for the future as a voice from the past is so refreshing and inspiring for this next generation or new generation of artists. And then her other work here within this is the 10 largest. Because as a trained artist, Af-Klint chose to devote her talent to expressing what she found in terms of what she saw in the spiritual world. And she drew upon the language of science, mathematics, esoteric texts, and mysticism to inform her work, rather than what was currently the artistic language of the time with Cubism, Post-Impressionism. Language and abstraction were her tools in her search for meaning. And she indeed created her own language around this. Excuse me. My favorite series, though, is the next one, is the Swan series. Excuse me. It's as if she's visualizing her direct knowledge of higher truths, of the process of the unmanifest to the manifest. And here's a shot, actually, excuse me, from the Serpentine Gallery in London in 2016 with my husband. He's holding a small postcard of some of his work, and even his color palette reminds me very much of the work that Hilma Af-Klint has in this work. And it's funny because even today, when you think about the pioneers of abstraction and how you can see their work today, it's almost somewhat kind of comical, but there's no doubt it's left an indelible mark on our culture. But what's interesting, this top left image, there's this new kind of immersive art experience, light art experience that's happening. We're seeing it with like Van Gogh, but now there's one with Kandinsky's work. We can go and do a Kandinsky light show. It's this thing called Carrier de Lumière. I apologize to my son Max, who's probably cringing at my poor French. But again, or you can get like go on a Redbubble and get like a shower curtain or a bedspread. I love what actually Yves Saint Laurent did in the 1960s by interpreting Mondrian's work into shift dresses at the time. So you can definitely immerse yourself, eat, sleep, and bathe, and clothe yourself in abstract art. So in terms of looking at an overlay of these artists with the Theosophical timeline, what's notable is that in 1912, when Kandinsky published concerning or on the spiritual and art, is how it got into the hands of so many artists. So there definitely is evidence that the likes of Georgia O'Keeffe, Jean Arp, who later on met Paul Klee, Robert and Sonia Delaunay, Theo van Doesburg, who also co-founded the De Stijl Neoplasticism movement with Mondrian, Arthur Dove, Marsden Hartley, František Kupka, all these artists. And then, of course, the artists, and then they go on to influence in terms of taking Kandinsky's writings and Theosophical kind of notions. Later on, Kandinsky was invited by Gropius to join the faculty of the Bauhaus, and then later on, Gropius would go on to the United States to basically usher in modernist architecture, especially through the Harvard Graduate School of Architecture. And even Jackson Pollock in 1928 was introduced to Theosophy and met Krishnamurti. And then later on, a couple years later, would even write about Theosophy. And I think it's also interesting here is that Mondrian, Af-Klint, and Kandinsky all passed away within a year of each other in 1944. So in conclusion, in the late 19th and early 20th century, with the spread of Theosophy, there's no doubt how many artists were having their, and I'm using Ron's counter quote here, close encounters of the third kind moment. They were responding to a spiritual urge that had ushered in the modern era. And to this day, we continue to build upon that legacy. So really, it is an amazing time to be an artist. And then we're all creative. We're creative beings. We create meals, gardens, our homes, art, and we create ourselves. We find our way closer and closer to the center of truth of who we are as souls, having a human experience and creative experience.